We are very pleased to have the presence of the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, an old friend, Christine Lagarde, who has been doing yeoman's work for a number of years on various hotspots in the world economy. And I can think of no one better to have here to give us a brief review of how she sees the world than Christine. I run into her all over. She's all over the world, China, Boao Forum. I could name all of these places. She never stops. And I don't think there's been a managing director of the International Monetary Fund who's covered more ground than Christine. My first question to you, and thank you for coming, is I've noticed in the latest forecast of the International Monetary Fund that you're somewhat more optimistic than the last report you've had over the last couple of quarters, both for this year and next year. And I'd be very interested, I know the audience would be, to get your thoughts, particularly on the United States, briefly United States, China, Europe, and Japan, in the sense of the developed world, and then what you think about the emerging markets and how that's playing into all of this. Because a year ago when we sat here, the IMF wasn't too optimistic and things didn't look too good. So I would just put that as an opener. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm delighted to be with you, but I would ask you to convey my best wishes to Jim, right, who was going to be with us. And I'm delighted to see many friends and familiar faces. So it's lovely to see you and to be with you. I think for the first time in many projections, many updates of our world economic outlook, for the first time we are revising upward. So in and of itself, I think it's an interesting proposition, because we are constantly anticipated that things would actually get better and got a bit worse. The second point about this forecast that was just released yesterday by Maury Opsfeld, our new chief economist, is that compared with a 3.1% growth last year, we are forecasting 3.5% growth this year, which is a significant upside from last year, and 3.6% for 2018, which is stable, same forecast that we had back in October. What's also interesting, third point, is that when I look at the column of forecast on a per region, per country basis, contrary to all the columns that we have had for the last 8 years since the financial crisis, there is not a single country that is contracting. So growth is actually across the board. And it applies to advanced economies as it does to emerging market economies and developing countries. On that latter note, I have to say that to see that sub-Saharan Africa is coming back a little bit, not certainly enough, on a per capita basis. I think it's minimal at best, but at least it's trending in a better direction than what we had seen, and that's where we need to see a lot of growth. The advanced economies that you've asked me to focus on, we clearly have a much stronger growth forecast for the United States as compared with last year. Same forecast from our January forecast, but that's almost, I mean, it's relevant for us, but it's not relevant in terms of job creations and activity. But there's a clear increase of GDP in the US, which is predicated on a variety of things. One is clearly a pickup from mid-2016, so it's not something that is just a recent development. It had been in the cards since mid-2016 with more investment, and the manufacturing sector is picking up in particular. And there has clearly been, in the last 3 months since the election, expectations that have been on the rise, which have also fueled the hope for better in terms of fiscal, small stimulus probably, better in terms of investment in infrastructure. What form it takes, we don't know yet, but it's in the air. And expectations that there will be a tax reform at minima, a corporate, and now we're talking about also household income tax reform that will also encourage growth. So that's for the US, and it's clearly a part of the economy that is a major engine going forward. And we're seeing it in the commodity markets. We're seeing it also in those countries that are heavy exporters towards the United States. Europe is stable at 1.7%. That's where we see it, but at least it's sort of consolidated growth at a too low a pace still, but getting at least on a par with last year. And Japan is doing a little bit better as well. So that's the picture as we have it for the advanced economies. We have seen a very mixed situation of the emerging market economies, and I hate to put them in one single bucket because they each have the idiosyncratic reasons for having been low or being on the rise now. If you look at China, for instance, we had seen China a little bit lower than where it is at the moment. There is clearly a continued stimulus, and investment continues to be on the rise, including in a housing sector which never seems to get tired or slowing down, and which is fueled by abundant credit, including from the shadow banking sector. We are seeing a Russia that had suffered from the low price of oil, but which is now picking up a bit now that the oil price is in the region of $50 rather than $30 per barrel. And Brazil is hopefully, coming back from what has been a very, very severe period where the combination of low demand, corruption, low commodity prices has clearly affected the country together with the political uncertainty. So that's, in a nutshell, the situation as it is. Now, I could go down the road of taking you through the downside risks on the horizon, which are more on the downside than the upside, and then the policy recommendation, and I would have done my job as managing director of the IMF. But I don't know whether you want me to do that or not.
Well, thank you. As you said, you gave it to us in a nutshell, but just following up on the world's second largest economy, which you mentioned briefly, China, one of the major concerns that people have about China is this tremendous increase in debt. The estimates go for 250% of GDP to 280% of GDP. That depends if you want to stick in the interbank borrowings. The point of the shadow banking, which you mentioned, which is not properly regulated, and actually the question of whether the state-owned banks are really showing the proper levels of non-performings. And then, of course, you get down to the whole question of overcapacity in the zombie companies in coal, steel, shipbuilding, etc. And one of the major concerns, as you know, is that this stuff is being pushed forward like it was like a snowplow there until after the 19th Party Congress this fall. And, China has been the great driver on commodities, and the concern is whether the government waits too long to tackle these problems before they become a major problem for China. And if it's a major problem for China, it's a major problem for the world growth. So maybe you might want to comment a little bit on that.
Well, I think you've said it all. In a way, you are Mr. China. I think you're very correct in your assessment. I would add that the policies that would be needed, which the Chinese authorities are needed, are probably not going to be put in place until a year from now, maybe a little less than a year from now. But once the Congress is over, then we are likely to see more movement than what we see at the moment. Everything that we hear, every analysis that we conduct drives us to that conclusion, that not a lot is going to happen, that there is some reform. I don't think we should just jump to the conclusion that nothing happens on particularly on the front of state-owned enterprises in two sectors, coal and to a lesser degree steel. There is a little bit happening. I hope what we see, comes next November, December, is a good, that the baton be passed on to the provincial authorities, because that's really an issue which the central government knows it has to tackle, is not going to leverage yet for the moment, but will have to, because that's where you have a lot of credit creation, and that's where the shadow banking is prospering at the clip of about 30% per year, which is huge.
Right. One of the areas that you've been concerned about, and there are a lot of economists worldwide, Marty Feldstein has done a lot of work on this, is the whole question of productivity. And you have mentioned that very often in your speeches as worldwide problem, particularly in the so-called advanced economies, developed world, whatever you want to say. And maybe you might want to have some comments on that.
Well, I did speak quite a bit about it recently, because we have just recently produced a paper that I highly recommend, which is a staff discussion note, actually, which in my view could be elevated to a higher degree, but that's something that we will decide upon later, which is called Gone with the Headwinds. So productivity. And I think the whole very thorough analytical work that has been done in that respect points us in the direction which is a little bit intuitive, actually, and not so much counterintuitive. That, number one, productivity is fueled by innovation, and there are policies that can work and that can be effective in order to stimulate and encourage innovation. Combination of public spending in some basic research programs combined with some research and development tax credits that are proving to be effective, as the Fiscal Affairs Department has demonstrated recently. So innovation on the one hand, public level combined with support to the private sector investment in innovation. That's number one. Number two, and a second finding of that paper, is that trade has clearly been an accelerator of productivity, and is therefore desirable if what we want to achieve is a better productivity in order to fuel growth, in order to reallocate better and to reach a more inclusive growth at the end of the day. And third, again, third conclusion of that paper is that there are legacies from the crisis that are actually weighing on the ability to increase productivity. And one good example of that is the fact that quite a few of those, not necessarily state-owned enterprises in China, but quite a few corporates, and not just in the United States for sure, are actually burdened by debt, which is actually putting a brake on their capacity to innovate and invest. Added to which, you have had companies that found themselves in a position where they have to go through fire sales of their assets, and therefore find themselves underinvested, with not enough capital, not enough innovations, and therefore ended as, incapacitated or crippled corporates that actually weigh on this productivity issue. I highly recommend the paper.
Well, I think we'll all make sure we read it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about also, which I think the fund has done yeoman's work on, and it's not been easy, and I know it's maybe a difficult moment to discuss it, but every time Jim introduces you here and asks for comments from the floor, I have my hand up asking about Greece, because I personally think, and I know these discussions are ongoing here, but I personally think the fund's attitude on insisting on debt relief is correct. And so maybe if you think you might say something in the midst of this on Greece, I think it would be very, very important, because it's a country that's basically been in recession for 7 years, which in most areas would be called a depression, not a recession. So, and I spent some time there a few months ago, and I think all of your feelings there, I see very strongly as you go around Greece.
Well, with a last name like yours, it's hardly surprising that you spent a bit of time in Greece, actually, and I envy you. Well, first of all, the IMF does not have a program with Greece, right, as we speak. So there have been programs in the past, but those programs are gone, and there is no program in place at the moment. Greece is under program with the ESM, which is the European Stability Mechanism, under the supervision of that institution and with clear support from the European Commission and the European Central Bank. The reason the IMF is not in a program with the others and is not forming part of the Troika as we used to, is that the conditions under which we could engage and put international community financing on those programs are not satisfied. And what I've always said repeatedly and boringly is that the program that we would put in place with Greece would have to walk on two legs. The first leg is significant reforms that will deliver sustainable growth going forward. So not the low-hanging fruits where you can actually fill in the hole and make sure that you reach a certain level of primary surplus, as has been done occasionally in the past, including under some of our programs. So sustainable, or sustainably, all right, I'll start back the other way. Reforms that affect the Greek economy so that it procures sustainable growth. And that's why we insist on tax reform and pension reform. And that pension reform, the Greek authorities know that it's badly needed because it drives them into a massive accumulated deficit, and one that continues to accumulate over the course of time. So that's leg number one. Leg number two, a debt of Greece that is sustainable. And as we see it at the moment, the debt of Greece is not sustainable, which leads us to the conclusion that at the present time, under current circumstances and reasonable hypotheticals, there has to be a debt restructuring. So until those two legs actually operate, we are not going to be in a program with Greece. Now, having said that, to be perfectly accurate with you, what we have seen in the last few weeks is encouraging on leg number one. So parametric reforms being accepted by the Greek authorities with a sequencing which over the course of time should not affect the growth that is now picking up a little bit. And this is what we are recommending. Of course, the devil is going to be in the details, which is why our team will be going back to Greece after the spring meetings to actually detail all that and make sure that it's in the legislation. The second leg, which is the debt sustainability analysis, we need to conduct on the basis of forecasts, hypotheticals that are sensible and reasonable, and that do not anticipate a primary surplus that is going to be at 3.5% for the next 10 years or so, because it's just not possible and not deliverable, and we know it. So I've been as exhaustive as I could.
No, I think you covered the problem very well, and just hope that the view of the fund prevails, because personally I think it's the right one. I think we would like, if you're willing, to open it up to a few questions. Sure. So if we have a few questions in the audience, we have a little time here, and if you'd raise your hand and just say who you are and who you represent, I think that the managing director will try and answer. Do we have a question? Jacob, you had your hand up, so. It's Jacob Frankel, JP Morgan Chase. I think everyone knows him, so Jacob.
Thank you, former economic counselor of the fund, which is my claim to fame.
Welcome home.
Years ago, the objective was always growth, and indeed you described what happens to growth. After a while, the mantra changed to sustainable growth, and more recently, you introduced inclusive growth. Now, the numbers that you mentioned at the beginning really did not relate to the inclusiveness or the sustainable. But I want really to ask about the inclusive. Is there any progress there, and do we have any reference in view of the numbers you told us about the aggregate growth? Thank you.
You know, I don't claim credit for the inclusiveness, although I would certainly fight for it. I think it was under the G20 Chinese presidency that the word inclusive found its way in the G20 communique, and we started having SSB, which was solid, sustainable, and balanced, to having SSBI, solid, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive. And I certainly hope that inclusive stays as an objective and one by which we want to measure success. You know, I think the objective of making it inclusive applies with three different dimensions to it. I think there is the issue of inclusiveness within a country, and the research that has been done by the research department here at the IMF clearly demonstrates that too much inequality leads to unsustainable growth, and therefore the objective of including, of reducing excessive inequality is, one demonstration of that sort of within-country dimension of inclusive. The second dimension is across, I would say, across generations and across gender. As you know, Jacob, I'm particularly keen on the latter. And I think that I don't need to convince anybody that women are very often either excluded, undercompensated, overexploited, and so on and so forth. And we will continue to do research in that respect, and we are streamlining and operationalizing under the bilateral surveillance that we do in Article 4, that particular dimension of the across generation and across gender. Across generation, what I mean by that is looking at the issue of debt, for instance, which is clearly climbing in many corners of the world, and where it's reaching levels that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And that's clearly a dimension that needs to be tackled, needs to be addressed, and I think we should continue to have those discussions. By the same token, passing on liabilities to the next generation is also, not caring much about climate change and the disaster that it could inflict on our economies. And it also means not necessarily maintaining infrastructures that going forward would be necessary for the expansion of an economy. So that's the intergenerational and intergender dimension of this inclusiveness. The last one is sort of between countries. How do we include? And in that respect, I'm going to plead for our chapel here, which is that decisions made in a particular corner of the world, particularly if those economies are systemic, will have an impact on other economies. And the spillover aspects of monetary policies, for instance, or the way in which a particular tax reform is conducted will have an impact on other economies, and those spillover effects need to be taken into account. So that's my sort of three-dimensional view of trying to be more inclusive.
Very complete answer. Let's hope you achieve it. Let's hope the world achieves it, because it's all of us together. Do you have time for one or two more?
Okay.
Okay.
Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. Madam,
Monsieur?
oh, good to see you. The title of the conference is The Future of Globalism and Multilateralism. I'm wondering if, on that point, you have seen or fear any change in the U.S. commitment to to multilateralism through the IMF and World Bank. Can or is the IMF prepared to do anything to address U.S. concerns about the failures of multilateralism through the Bretton Woods organizations? And finally, on that point, would the IMF be prepared to issue its ESR or its external balance assessment or exchange rate assessment on a more regular basis, as it does with the Fiscal Monitor, the WEO, and the GFSR?
Thank you, Jan, for those easy questions. So you don't have to bother repeating them tomorrow, unless I don't respond to your questions now. Let me just go to the ESR. It's, as you well know, it's a very heavy-duty work, which leads us to assess on a per-country basis for about 29 of them, if I recall, that cover about 80% of total GDP. Not only they currency relative to others, but their reserves, their current account, and several other elements. And it just analyzes their external position. We try to make the best use of that into the bilateral surveillance that we do on an annual basis, once a year. So the fact that we actually operate these two in parallel, and that one actually feeds the other, so that we can find in each and every Article 4 of those 29 countries the ESR assessment that is conducted on a cohesive basis, where we keep those 29 countries together. I think that really pleads strongly in favor of having it once a year. And you know, some of those components don't vary with as much regularity and periodicity as other elements. So as it stands, I think the ESR is a complicated exercise. There is an element of judgment about it, which needs to be scrutinized, which needs to be challenged eventually when it's you know, supported by the desk of a particular country. And all of that needs the intellectual integrity and the time that it takes to actually get to the bottom of that judgmental part of it, which we try to reduce to the maximum. You know, on the rest of it, multilateralism is, as you know, the essence of this institution and the reason why it was set up as it was 70 years ago. 70 years is no guarantee for perennity. And it requires that we re-examine the services that we provide, that we constantly respond to the needs of the international community and the membership. It is no surprise that we provide a lot more technical assistance than we had in the past. It is no surprise that the surveillance itself has evolved from being much more bilateral to being much more multilateral as well. It is no surprise that we look at macro-critical issues such as gender, such as equality, such as climate change, for instance, whenever that is macro-critical in a particular country. So the institution is changing, and we will continue to do that in order to adjust to the needs of the membership. And we will be listening to all members as they themselves change over the course of time. But everything that I have seen leads me to believe that all members believe in the virtue and the value of free, fair and global trade, for instance. And I believe that all members are keen to examine what can be done in order to make sure that trade benefits all under conditions that are fair and that constitute a level playing field. And we will continue to try to deliver on that front.
Thank you very much. I think if we have time for one more question, but I think your comments on trade and the importance of trade are really right up front with what's going on in the world today, without a doubt. So one more question, and please try and make it one question, not 3 or 4. Yes.
I'm Dee Smith, CEO of Strategic Insight Group and also Vice Chair of the Advisory Committee of the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies at University of Texas. So my question is about Latin America, and I wondered if you could comment on what you see going on there, particularly with 3 key countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico, but in general, in terms of the things that you're observing. Thank you.
I asked the same question to the head of the Latin American department because it's well, first of all, it's a continent, but it has you know, clearly different countries following different paths, and depending on whether they have copper or plenty of agriculture, or if they have oil, or if they are the Caribbeans, which are also, from our perspective, part of that region as well, they have a different fate. But what we see is a region that has had the benefit of sort of low cost of financing, high prices of commodities, a relative political stability in the main, and as a result, quite a few prosperous years. That was until about 4 years ago, when things began to change. And for the last 3 years, most of those not all of them, but I would put Mexico a little bit apart. I think Mexico is a bit of that sort of juncture between 2 regions. But most of those countries have had either negative or very, very low growth. And the whole region was driven down by Brazil in particular, which is clearly the largest and the one that was not doing well. So what we're seeing going forward is a relative stability at around 1.5% growth for the region, with different phenomena depending on the situation, and particularly the price of commodities and the kind of exports that those countries benefit from. We're also seeing sources of big concern. Venezuela is one, clearly. it's not a question of if, but a question of when. And we are all very concerned watching it happen. Mexico is, you know, a case in and of itself. And the discussions that are going on at the moment under NAFTA, the way in which NAFTA is being renegotiated and how it will affect Mexico is going to be critical for the for that country. There are elections coming up in a little over a year now in Mexico, which will have an impact as well on the future of Mexico. So I would again put Mexico a little bit aside because it's far more dependent on the policies decided in the U.S. and the NAFTA arrangement than the rest of Latin America. But what the teams tell me is that Latin America, for the moment, is going to sort of grow at that stable, albeit relatively low rate of growth going forward.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much, first of all, for making these premises available for us, for all the support you give us, because we deeply believe, all of us here, in the work that you and your staff are doing. And I think the world really needs you and your staff. I mean, the situation in Greece, I think the attitude, this is a personal opinion that you're taking there, I think is very, very important as an example. And so, again, thank you for giving us your time. And let's give her a big hand for the work she and the fund do.